Umkhonto, Sizwe, founded in 1961, subsequently became the military wing of the African National Congress. Its storied history was illuminated by the contributions of a number of legendary units, including the Lutuli detachments and the G5. Another of them, the Special Operations Unit, forms the basis of our discussion today. Here to discuss it with us is Yunus Carrim, a political activist, sociologist, journalist, ANC MP for 30 years, South African Communist Party Central Committee and Politburo member, and most recently and relevantly, author of Striking at the Heart of Apartheid, the ANC MK Special Operations Unit. Welcome, Yunus.
Thula, I'm glad you're saying striking, because that was my suggestion for the title. But as you know, you've published many books. The publishers decide, and then they said, no, attacking. It saves us a word. I said striking because it's so much more like, let's say, evocative. So I'm glad at least subconsciously.
It lives on there.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Yunus. We're very excited to have you. And I would love to start off with a very broad-based question, just for the benefit of, well, both myself and the general listener. When was Umkhonto Sizwe formed, by who, and why?
Yeah, basically it was formed on the 16th of December, 1961. It's basically commonly known as MK, Spear of the Nation. It was formed after a series of, over many decades actually, but particularly in the 50s, escalating repression by the apartheid state. And in particular, the killing of 69 unarmed protesters who were demonstrating against the unjust pass laws, which only Africans had to bear at that time. 69 people were killed. Many actually, you and Thula will know more, while they were fleeing. So they were shot in the back. But there were discussions even before that event about the futility of pursuing peaceful negotiations because the state was totally intransigent. So the ANC turned to armed struggle, in my view, very grudgingly, very reluctantly, almost apologetically. And again, it was very clear that it was going to be directed towards bringing the National Party government to the negotiating table. I don't think, I mean, you may disagree, the two of you, I don't think they sought at that stage to bring the state down through an armed struggle. They wanted the government to come to its senses, as Mandela said. And they waged a series of sabotage attacks, isolated attacks on post offices during nights when nobody was there, police stations that were closed, to other government buildings and railway lines now and then, I think pylons and so on. And so they took to armed struggle as part of an ongoing attempt, a different form of it obviously, to negotiate with the government for a non-racial dispensation, democratic dispensation. That essentially is how I understand it, yes.
I will add to that, as a child who grew up in the 80s, early 90s, and also being Afrikaans and in an Afrikaner community, when I first learned this history in high school, I remember looking at my teacher and saying, very puzzled, but why did the ANC ever think that they would be able to reason with an autocratic state like the apartheid government? Just growing up in such an autocratic environment, and knowing the cultural codes, one just knew that there won't be any reason at all, and they will definitely not listen to reason, and anything else will escalate. So I find this fascinating in terms of this, the thinking and the turn from passive resistance to an armed struggle, and then the measures or the way in which it grows from there on.
Yes, I think that it's also maybe that generation, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and so on. They were very, let's put it this way, there was a sort of like, unlike now, and unlike in later years, unlike certainly after 1976, there was this outcome maybe of the education they got, which came from the missionary schools. this idea underlying some of them. Well, Governor Mbeki was a Marxist and I doubt was a believer, but overall there was this culture of you don't turn to violence and so on. It applied to other religions too. I think it was their formal education, and they were very polished. They were gentlemen, really. Very different from Tsietsi Mashanini and the post-1976 generation. And while I agree with what you're saying, it does seem to me that ultimately what happened in 1990 was remarkable. I mean, it wasn't as if the ANC was strong enough to overthrow the state, nor was it as if the state was strong enough to contain the ANC endlessly. I think, what the Afrikaner historian Herman Khiliomi said, if I recall correctly. He said something about instead of a balance of power, you had a balance of weakness. Neither side had won and neither side had lost. And we have to give some credit where it's due. The National Party could have continued for some years, but it wouldn't have survived, The country would have been destroyed. But they did agree to negotiate. And they did finally accept defeat in elections. That's unusual. The very same Afrikaners that 30 years earlier were as intransigent as you say they were, and indeed they were. The ANC had no choice but to take up armed struggle. In fact, they took up armed struggle partly, here again, maybe it's the background. I don't know, Thula, I know your writings more, obviously. You may know more about this, but, they took up the armed struggle partly, as they themselves say, the leadership of the ANC, to manage what were outbreaks of violence in Pondoland and elsewhere. They felt if you let it go spontaneously, it could become like a civil war situation. And they were there also to manage and control and strategize and organize. And I think I have this in the book somewhere, probably towards the end or maybe in the first two chapters. The ANC submissions to the TRC, I think it was August 1997, and there was a further one, the two submissions made to the overall submissions, to me, are a remarkable moral case for the armed struggle. They quote a scholar, an eminent scholar, saying that the ANC's case for the armed struggle is one of the most eloquent moral justifications for a just war. And, when I read for the first time for this project, the Special Ops project, the two submissions, I think it was August 1997 and May 1998. No, August 1996 and May 1997, but you can look up the two submissions. I must say I was taken aback at how well argued the case was for the armed struggle. And you also see slivers of this reluctant turn to the armed struggle. And overall, while there were some deaths caused by the ANC's armed struggle, it's remarkable how few people died, certainly compared to how many people's lives the state had destroyed. So, my own view, for what it's worth, those two texts should be, in the history books, really. They should be matric school scholars, learners looking at it, but first-year history students and so on. You don't have to agree with the armed struggle. You don't have to agree with what's there, but it's such an important part of our collective history, wherever we belong politically or we don't see ourselves as political beings. It's a remarkable document, really. And this brings me to something else I'd like to talk about, how much I have got out of this project, how it's influenced me, and how much I've actually learned. And I wouldn't have, I think, ever come to those two documents that the ANC presented. It's remarkably well written and structured. And the case for the armed struggle, the justification for it, moral, political, strategic, it's a remarkable document, really.
May I would like us to get into the armed struggle and speak about where the Special Operations Unit fits into it, because we're more than a decade into the armed struggle when there's the decision to form this new unit. What is the conjuncture of the armed struggle in the late 1970s? What has happened that leads the ANC to feel that we need to have this organ established?
Yes, well, obviously, there were the acts of sabotage and then the state repression between 1960 and 64. Most MK units were completely destroyed, either through arrests or through people fleeing the country into exile. There were some attempts at resuscitating it, but nothing much came of it. And then, of course, politically, the mood began to change. The 1969 dock workers' strike in Durban, 1973 Durban strikes, as we call it. Both those, of course, were not under the influence of the ANC, so even the Black consciousness or any other political movement. If anything, the most prominent figure that emerged during the 1973 strikes was Bani Dladla of the IFP. But of course, students and others emerged who entered this terrain of the strikes and the trade union movement and turned it towards a more radical approach. And so you got the emergence of the radical trade union movement. But when the 76 uprisings occurred, the ANC was hardly there. Not that it wasn't, it just wasn't there enough. And the ANC was concerned that it was tailing what is happening in South Africa. It was not visible enough. In fact, if there was any structure that was, it was a Black consciousness movement. Though I think a lot of it was very spontaneous to the student uprisings, youth rebellion of 1976. So the ANC had to make its presence felt. It had no substantial base inside the country. It had certain political units, mostly set up by Robben Islanders who had returned from spells of imprisonment, but they were not strong enough. And they were isolated. And what they really wanted was to find out how they can accelerate the struggle as a whole. The armed struggle, but the struggle as a whole. And so they went to Vietnam in 1978, a delegation, senior delegation led by Tambo, Oliver Tambo, the president of the ANC. And they spent 2 weeks there, and they were trying to learn from the experiences of armed struggle in Vietnam. And they were told by the Vietnamese, look, your terrain is not conducive to a guerrilla struggle, the traditional rural guerrilla struggle with liberated zones and you encircling the urban areas and so on. It's not going to work. Your terrain is completely different. Your social base is really the working class. You don't have much of a peasantry. And what you need really is a very strong political underground and a very strong, even stronger actually, mass base, overt mass struggles, like came to be through the United Democratic Front. And they said, what you should really be focusing on is a particular form of armed struggle, not guerrilla warfare, not just urban stuff, armed propaganda. The aim being to communicate to people inside the country, you're alive, you're here, and to mobilize them through carrying out acts of sabotage, if you want to call it that, armed activities that are very visible and inspire people to mobilize on the ground because they can't have access to immediately. And some will join you. Young people will join you, new people. People who are more connected to South Africa than many of you, having left the country in the early 60s, are. So it is that when they came back, this delegation led by Tambo, they set up a commission that the NEC sanctioned, National Executive Committee of the ANC, to look into what can be done, having learned these lessons from the Vietnamese. So they had a Green Book Commission, as it was called, out of which came the Green Book, in which basically it was said that this is what we have to do, build a strong mass base inside the country and a political underground. And that's where our armed struggle should be directed. So out of these discussions, Slovo was part of that commission. Slovo went to go and see Oliver Tambo and said, look, can't we set up a special operations unit? Many traditional armies also have, special operations units. Let us set up our own one, a small one, a select one, strategically recruited, whose aim would be to hit high impact, high visibility, economic, including energy and military targets. And these people that we chosen, these cadres, they will be trained apart from other MK comrades, and they would be given specialized training, and they would be separated as far as possible from the work of other MK units. And the advantage of this, he argued, would be that you could operate anywhere in the country, whereas the ANC's units were geographically bound. So they call them machineries. So you had the Transvaal urban machinery, in which Sizwe and Nyanda, MK and Mgebuze played a very prominent role, the G5 that you just referred to now, the Thula. You had the Transvaal rural machinery, the same with old Natal, and so on. Now, those units within those machineries, the machineries had units, specific units within it. They would target localized the areas, and they'd be bound by them. But special ops could operate anywhere. And you'd not have to go through the bureaucratic process of MK. You'd not have to share any information with Joe Modise, the MK commander. Tambo will answer or give him, or Slovo would reports now and then. It would avoid all the accountability processes that had made the ANC very vulnerable, as did other things that were happening in the ANC to spies and infiltration and so on. Many units or comrades who came in units or even individuals crossed the border and they would be arrested. So there was a high level of infiltration. So Tambo wanted this unit and Slovo agreed to it, especially after the very successful first operation of this unit, the SASOL 1980 attack. And initially it was that the NEC agreed that Tambo would take responsibility for special ops. Slovo would be its commander, answerable to Tambo. And let's see what happens. And when SASOL succeeded the way it did, it became a permanent unit. And Tambo had instructed Thomas Ngobi, the ANC treasurer, to give them the resources that they need. Other units got resources in drips and drabs, but here they were given full amounts of money. And the more they succeeded, the more the door opened to resources. And this also led to tensions, obviously, if you care to pursue that aspect later, between special ops at times and other MK units who felt that they were being advantaged, special ops was, by the attention given directly by Oliver Tambo and Joe Slovo, and by the fact that they were, given more resources and they were allowed to recruit potentially the best in the MK camps in Angola.
That is precisely, that leads us right into my burning question, because you spoke of the selectivity of this special operations unit and strategic recruiting. And precisely that, how were members identified, selected, recruited?
Oh, yes. What would happen is, Slovo, Sizwe Nyanda has a lovely comment that's captured in the book. I can't quite remember his words. He says, well, you see, they could get the best, the cream of the crop from the camps. Now, who can question Joe Slovo? We all respected him. And he had the gravitas. He could go to the camp and speak to the camp commanders and say, give me 5 or 6 or 10 people whom you think are very good and would make a very good unit to go in, to recruit. He wouldn't say for what, and so on. So when Slovo first came to the camps, he had already decided that Obadi, Monso Mokhabudi, I'm going to tell you something that's a bit odd for me, who's not been part of the armed struggle. I played other roles. Like, they still, many of them are called by the MK names, right? So Sizwe and Nyanda, often when others refer to him, they call him Gebuza. Ismail Abu Baker, the longest surviving special ops commander, is often referred to as Rashid. So, and Obadi, who's also a legend, by the way, died in the Matola attack in January 1981, precisely for the special ops work that he did, and in particular the SASOL 1980 operation. So Obadi was very impressive, according to Slovo, and so he appointed him as the commander answerable directly to Slovo. So Obadi comes to the Funda camp, which is like the finishing camp for the ANC's guerrillas were coming into the country. It's, once you're in Funda, you're more likely to go into the country. Now, Rashid had been trained in Germany, East Germany, and he was now the chief instructor in Funda. So Buddy turns up there and says, look, I want you to train people. They being trained specifically to hit the oil refineries, SASOL, but they mustn't know from you what it is that is being targeted. So Rashid works with the famous Bani Molekwane, a legend in the MK ranks and even beyond in the ANC generally, in the movement as a whole, and even beyond there. So Bani Molekwane assisted him, and so did Ernest Pule play some role. And they were separated from the camp they were in Funda, and taken elsewhere and trained. And then Slovo comes together with Obadi, discusses the potential of the people who had been trained, and Rashid made some suggestions, and between the three of them, they decided who would constitute the core to be carrying out the SASOL operation. Until then, the comrades didn't know who would go, and they certainly didn't know their target. And with 5 minutes notice, Rashid was suddenly told, no, we want you too. So he was taken aback because he wasn't expecting it. So he goes also with the rest of them to Maputo, where they're given further political training and discussion of strategies, a lot of collective discussion. If David Moisi's telling of the story is correct and it's echoed by others, there was no like top-down thing. And that's the marvelous thing about Slovo. A lot of the interviewees say that he had this way of making them feel that they had a full say, because they are the people going into the country, not he. Rashid also is commended for that. So David says that they weren't given instructions. They were told, this is what we want to do, comrades. What are your ideas? And so on. And of course, David Moisi and Bani Molekwane come into the first reconnaissance of SASOL 1. And when they come back, they are asked for their ideas. You are going into the country. You know how to move around there. What is it you think should be done? So they were then broken up into 3 units. So to come back to the choice of people, I think I've explained it, but obviously when they make choices, they're not always right. Some of the people that they recruited into the ranks in later years particularly were not up to the task. But the first lot, they were outstanding. And there was hardly a glitch. And that was the SASOL 1980 operation, 31st May into early hours of 1st of June 1980. There were commanders who felt ill at ease, to say the least, that they couldn't have access to the best of the best, as it were. In fact, Sipiwe is quite frank. He says, look, Slovo could go in and ask for this fellow and that fellow. Then after he's left, we go in and ask for others. Although I must tell you, the G5 unit also had wonderful people in it, very efficient, very effective, very committed. Well, no different from, in some senses, the MK Special Ops unit. There were other units as well. There were units here in the Western Cape that also, there's a book that Penguins published. Some of them were trained inside, others outside. But, you must be, I want to stress this, if I may, since we've come to where we have. You see, you can't separate MK Special Ops from MK. It was within the mandate of MK, although it had different accountability processes, right? And it had a very specific mandate, not to carry out what we call pot boiling or routine operations, but special operations. But it was very much a part of MK. Within the tradition of MK, it operated within, and you can't separate either the armed struggle from the overall national liberation struggle. I mean, it's interrelated with the other forms or pillars of struggle. The ANC's word is pillars. That is mass struggle, which is primary, underground political struggle, and of course, international campaigns, international pressure on the apartheid regime. So they're all interdependent. But anyway, that's the way they were recruited, and it did arouse some resentment. But of course, Ronnie will say no. The resentment was very minimal, and it may have occurred among commanders who are competing for resources. And that's the thing also. And Yabus is very open about it. When MK Special Ops hit some very high visible, high impact targets, other units said, hey, we too can do that. And so I asked CP and Nyanda, I said, I hear when they hit SASOL, you said, yeah, we're going to hit something even bigger. He said, yeah, we said that. If we had the resources, we would have done it. So there was, if you like, a certain competition or rivalry. And in a way, it contributed to people becoming a bit more determined to be more effective. And Rashid and others have it that they picked up after SASOL, which I think we must speak about in a moment. But I'll come to that when we get there. But, basically what MK did was it boost the morale of people in the camps, many of the youth who left thinking that after a few weeks they'll get some training and come back to fight. But they were stranded there. The ANC couldn't bring them into the country. And many of them were immensely frustrated. And the conditions in the camp were not as nice as being even in a council home in Soweto or in the rural areas where their families were and so on. So they wanted to fight. So when SASOL occurred, it shook them. And they all wanted to join SASOL and even the other big operations that MK carried out. So Gibuza describes it as a brilliant idea to have a special ops unit.
Let's speak about the aftermath of SASOL. So you've got the inaugural operation. It's a big splash. I mean, in my research, it was reported on the front cover of newspapers as far away as England, London. Spectacular, largest blast in South African history. During that first period, the sort of fighters of the first hour, we've mentioned SASOL, but what about other very prominent operations such as Voortrekker Hoogte and the Koeberg attack? I'm speaking about, can you just fill us in with the unit's evolution in that 1980 to 82 period?
Yeah. The thing is that, in a way, to assess the others, you also have to look at SASOL more closely. They chose SASOL exactly because it was part of their mandate to hit high visibility, high impact targets, which the regime couldn't avoid suppressing information on. How do you do that with smoke up to 4,000 meters in the sky, right? There's this wonderful description by Cohen and Muscadi, citizen journalists who were in an helicopter monitoring what was going on in SASOL the day or two after the explosion. And they said 7,000 meters high. And from what they could see, the smoke was 4,000 meters high. And they described it, I thought, very evocatively, like a volcano gone mad. And this is a Citizen, mind you, a state newspaper. And so it is that the title of that chapter, in inverted commas, is drawn from there, like a volcano gone mad. I mean, there were three units. One hit SASOL 1 and Natref, which is close to each other. Another unit hit SASOL 2 in Secunda, the first being Sasolburg. And the third was Piwe going to Fleur, the offices of the company that was building SASOL 2 and SASOL 3. Now, if you combine the three operations, the hit on SASOL 1 and Natref was the most dramatic, right? It really was stunning. I've also, by the way, Thula picked up some of the things. You would have picked up more about images, and it made world news. I mean, there were 8 huge storage fuel tanks hit. They wanted to hit the fractionating tower, which is like the main hub. The production comes to a halt. You cannot continue. But they couldn't reach it because in the one case, SASOL 1, there were workers there. And it meant huge destruction of lives. And these were mainly African workers, but whatever workers were there, that aim wasn't to kill anybody. In fact, nobody was killed. One security officer was shot who picked up that the fence had been broken. But I mean, there were no deaths, given all the drama. The black smoke that covered SASOL 1 spread 80 kilometers to the southern suburbs of Johannesburg. And smoke and fire could be seen for 3 days. Some journalists claim 6 days, but it seems to me more credible 3 days. 400 firefighters were brought in from the SADF and everywhere else to put out this fire, which they only managed to do 3 or more days later. I think it was beyond the expectations of even Slovo and Tambo, you know. And the one at Secunda, it wasn't so visually spectacular. They also couldn't reach the fractionating tower, but it didn't matter, because who cares in the camps in Angola and ANC in exile and amongst the youth of 1976, who cares what was hit? The picture was remarkable. And there are some marvelous photographs in the newspapers that I hope to put online. Not I hope, I will shortly. And interestingly, when I think it's David Miliband, the foreign secretary, British foreign secretary, was asked by the BBC one day, do you think violence is ever justified for any struggle? And he said, well, look at the ANC struggle. And he drew on the SASOL experience. And he said that armed struggle, I don't know if he uses that word, he uses the word violence. That word is meaningless to somebody like me and many of us. Violence is like random. It's a multiplicity of forms. This is an organized, systematic, strategically decided action, armed struggle, linked to a goal, right? It can't be reduced to GBV or, you know, violence in the streets because of the structural situation of South Africa, where people get drunk on a Friday in Soweto and understandably turn to each other. Violence is different. So the armed struggle, but I think he used the word violence. And then the point he's making is, he said, look, violent stroke armed struggle in itself won't lead to your goals. But without it, you may not get there. And certainly in the ANC's case, if it wasn't for SASOL and other operations, they wouldn't have got to where they have. This interview was done, I think, in 2000 or so. So that really inspired people. And Rashid said when they were going into the camps, and Pule says the same thing, Ernest Pule, Opaz is known, T-Man, you know, they have multiple MK names. I don't know what happened to you, Thula, but it was very difficult putting down who's who. Believe me, I spent hours, because the same person has got 5 MK names, right? In different situations, they're different. And then in the same unit, you know, people didn't know real names. So when you say to, there's a wonderful quip from Makwali and Yalunga. I said to him, you know, you gave me these 2 different spellings, right? And now the name sounds different. So he shoots back at me. He says, hey, Carrim, listen here. We didn't have name tags, you know, when you're going into the country to know a name and then brackets MK name. I don't know, you know, you speak English. I said, yes, but it's not an English name. So I had to look it up. So, you know, when I told some of these people, do you know who that is? They said, no, it can never be. I know him. You know, he's working in the municipality there or something. I say, no, that was your unit comrade. They don't know the names, right? And then you go to Department of Military Veterans. They say, no, but Yunus, we don't have the MK names. We got their real names. So I battled, but you know, I got that table there, and I think it's largely, well, I think mostly, almost only accurate. But you know, what I'm saying basically is that it's that SASOL operation that actually inspired people. You know, Rashid says there's no success. There's no way of breeding success except through success. And that really inspired people. So comes the next operation. It's the one you're referring to, Thula. I think the power stations. That was on the 21st of July, 1981. And that's a marvelous operation. They hit 3 power stations within a few hours. They hit Delmas. Well, first they hit Arnott, I think Camden and Delmas. Now, of course, today, even those people, if they were alive, would shudder at the thought of blackouts, okay? Today, load shedding, municipal load shedding, let's forget Eskom's load shedding, at least you know when it's coming, okay? In my municipality, I'm in Cape Town now, but this is not really my main home base. I won't mention my municipality, I'm letting them down, it's happening all over. You have municipal load reduction while you're busy doing something, cooking or whatever, the lights go off. Now, I can assure you, if those comrades were alive, well, Mapwala is here. I ask him, hey, what you think of load shedding? He'll resent it, right? But in those days, it had a very different meaning. And a figure I picked up is that at that stage, while 90% of whites had electricity, 80% of Africans didn't. But that wasn't the issue. It was that it's so important to the economy to have electricity. And MK wanted to show, the ANC wanted to say, hey, we can hit you at your heart. Come and talk to us. Or if you don't, this is going to escalate. We hit SASOL last year. Now we're hitting your electricity base, right? And we're coming for other things. And that's exactly what happened. Because shortly after that came the operation Thula just asked, Thula, about Voortrekker Hoogte. That was remarkable also in its own way. You see, they, for the first time ever, they used a Grad P rocket launcher. And it's a big, I looked it up on the internet, and there's photographs in the Star on page 1 trying to frighten people. Why? It's, look at these terrorists, what they're doing. So they targeted the main SADF military base. As Rashid said, they could never in their wildest of imaginations thought that the ANC will hit a frontal attack on the SADF from 4.5 kilometers away. That Grad P launcher you can use 6 kilometers away from your target. And they were trained in it, Bani Molekwane particularly, and they fired 5 rockets. And I've tried and tried, maybe Thula and you, Lindie, you got the resources. I couldn't find anywhere where we could tell exactly what they hit. But they did hit some buildings, and some of the rockets just landed, I think, on the ground. One of them certainly. Did it matter? No. To people inside the country and outside, it showed the ANC is alive. It's taking on the army, the hated army. So it was something that I think stunned the SADF. They set up roadblocks and they started going into the trains and searching people. I mean, ordinary civilians who had no connection with the act. Some of them probably didn't even know it took place. So what was remarkable there was one of the comrades who took part in this was a guy called Johannes Mnisi. He's got a very interesting history. You read the book. And a remarkable guy in his own way. He mobilized a friend of his school friend, Philemon, I think it is. And he said to Philemon, please, can we use your van? Now, let me say also that the Grad P was very, very difficult to actually get into South Africa. They got a Ford F-250 van, which is quite a big van. And they put a metal frame underneath and they did letter box where they cover it. And I think the barrel of the Grad P is 2.54 meters. And the weight of it is 100 kilograms. And what had happened was a Nicholas Heath and a Bonnie Muller from England had come to South Africa and they hired a farm. I think it was called Mooiplaas, small holding. And they told the owner they want to rent it for several months and they paid up front. And they said, Nicholas is not well and he's trying to recuperate. And they presented themselves as a married couple. Well, firstly, Nicholas was not at all sick. He was fine. Secondly, they weren't even married. Thirdly, they had been recruited through the British Communist Party by Joseph Slovo to set up a base from which the MK Special Ops Unit could carry out this attack. And they went to Swaziland. The truck was brought to them. Guido van Ecken, the Belgian internationalist, and Rashid in the book described vividly the difficulties they had in getting this Grad P under that van. After all the efforts, I think it was into 3 days, 3 nights, when Nicholas Heath and Bonnie Muller come to the border post, the South African side, the van comes to a halt and they try switching it on and the ignition wouldn't work. Now they are terrified. because that van has got a grappy underneath it, right? So they push the van and they're very distraught and nervous. And remember, they're British also. They're not steeled in the South African struggle. Though they were wonderfully brave to come and do this. Now they're pushing the van and it's very hard to push because it's very heavy. Then the security policemen with their dog come and help them to push the van. The very van that is used a few days later to knock out the SAD or to hit this SADF military base. So they push the van and mercifully the van starts working. And so the police waved at them goodbye and let them go off because they didn't want to stop them and search them. Interestingly, the dog didn't sniff it either because the ANC had quite a sophisticated way of covering the explosives, I think with plastics, and they used to put some oil or something over it so that the dogs don't pick it up. So you had several of these like surrealistic incidents where like members of the state security apparatus, unbeknown to them, are assisting. Now take the SASOL operation. I can't resist saying this. So Bani Molekwane, being quite a, he's a very flamboyant, charismatic, lively, brave, almost impulsive to some extent guy. He's the operational commander for SASOL 1. So now it's bitterly cold. It's the night before they're going to hit SASOL 1. And he and his comrades are supposed to sleep there in a bush nearby. Now they decide, hey, to hell with this, it's too cold, right? Now in those days, you're historians, I don't know how this happens. I've asked others and they don't know. You could go to a police station if you were looking for a job. And if there was an empathetic policeman there, presumably an African policeman, maybe it was part of a Bantustan unit carved out in that absurd way. So they go to the police station and they tell the guy there, listen, man, we're looking for jobs here. We're migrants. Can we sleep here? So they hand over their forged dumpas and they sleep there. And the next day, the policemen say bye-bye, assisting them to go and hit SASOL, right? And there's some wonderful stories you'll pick up with Marion Spark and the police, but there isn't time to cover that. And, I must say, the interviews were wonderful because they were so lively. And people laugh now at some of the absurdities that terrified them then. But 35, 40 years later, they think it's hilarious. So, you see, if you look at these three operations, right? I mean, that was the marvelous period of special ops because they hit the fuel through SASOL, then electricity through the three attacks on the power stations on one night, and then now the army. So they hit major economic and military targets. You see, until that attack on Voortrekker Hoogte, excuse me, there was no direct confrontation with the army. There was a wonderful G5 unit of Sipiwe Nyanda that hit 5 police stations, or I think 5 or so police stations, and set up an internal unit for the first time ever in the country. And one of the comrades, they survived right up to 1990, but he wasn't active regularly. Then there was also Bani Molekwane skirmishes with the SADF and police in the Western Transvaal. We were trying to set up a base inside the country in the rural areas. But there was no direct attack on the SADF. And this was the first. The aim wasn't to, obviously, as I said earlier, overthrow the army. It's a balance of power is out, right? That's why you call it a guerrilla struggle. So that also lifted people's spirits. And then we go to another marvelous operation, Koeberg, December 1982. It's a very, very interesting story, too long to explain, but it has to deal with Rodney Wilkinson, who got a job at Koeberg. He came from a hippie culture of the late 60s, early 70s, right? And he was always rebellious. Came from a middle-class family, very rebellious, and very anti-authoritarian. But he needed a job. Interestingly, he was the national fencing champion. Now, you look at the ANC, right? If you look, Marv Anderson has something nice that she says in a blurb in the book. She says, the range of people that took part in special ops is remarkable. So you had people who were involved in criminal activity, you had a draftsman, stroke architect, and those are architects as well, Oscar Malay, and you had a national fencing champion, and so on. And a guy who's generally described in the media and in some other articles as an unlikely saboteur, but I have my own views on that, and I deal with that in the book. But for now, just to say that he decided one day to steal the plans without any sense of what he's going to do. He just didn't support nuclear energy. And he then speaks to his partner, Heather Gray, and says, look, I've got these plans. Let's do something with them. So she suggests, why don't we go and give it to the ANC? So finally, they get going. They go to Zimbabwe, and they connect with the ANC via Mac Maharaj, and they hand the plans over. Mac and Slovo and others. Slovo, I think, checks it out with the East Germans, and I don't know, somebody in Moscow, and I think people in Britain. They said, no, these plans are genuine. So they come back to Rodney and say, thanks for the plans. Now, would you kindly do the operation? And he was flawed. He says, I'm not cut out for these things. I merely gave it to you, thinking, as Heather said, you'll get a crack unit to go and carry out the operation. They said, no, you work there. You know the plant. And Rashid said, we've been wanting to hit this plant, but this thing like fell on our lap, so to speak. So they persuaded him, and after a while, he agreed. Not a long while either. He just felt, look, let me do it. All right, I hate this plant, Koeberg, and I hate apartheid. And Heather encouraged him. So they worked together. He carried out the operation. She was there to support him. And Rashid assisted a lot. But, Rodney was very creative. So he put 4 limpet mines. He did it to go off over a weekend when very few people will be at work. It was 2 weeks before it became operational. So you had to ensure that when you carry out the operation, there's no radioactivity. It will destroy lives. And the ANC will never forgive itself, let alone be forgiven by its own sympathizers globally and inside the country. So on the weekend, I think of the 18th and 19th, the 4 limpet mines went off. P.W. Botha, then the Prime Minister, flew down on the second day on Sunday. Outraged, they had convened an urgent cabinet meeting on the Monday. They were stunned. And this, as Heather says, Rodney kept saying, is the plum of the establishment. It was the only, of course, nuclear power plant in the whole of Africa until now as well. So they were really stunned. In fact, many of them refused to accept that it's the ANC could do such a slick operation. One of the ESCOM managers or leaders said it was the Bada Meinhof gang, the West German anarchist guerrilla group, right? Somebody else said, now it's, I think, Freematon, the company that's building it. Because in terms of the contract, if the finalization of the plant was delayed, for every extra day beyond the contractually agreed date, the company will be paid extra. So they felt that company did it to earn more money. And what's stunning, actually, years later, here's Rodney Wilkinson, part of National Intelligence Service. So he, Rashid, and Heather, and I think so on, go to visit the plant. And later, one of them speaks to the chief investigator. And the chief investigator says, nah, the ANC didn't do that. Even after Rodney Wilkinson was exposed in the media to be behind it with his partner, Heather, even after they visited the plant and Rodney showed them where he put the limpet mines and so on. And he describes vividly how the people working there at the time that the operation took place, whom he saw when he went, I think he went about after 1994, I think it was about 10, 15 years later they went there. Those people said they were terrified. They didn't know where the next one was going to go off. And here's Rodney, being humane, saying, I felt very sorry for them. And then he said one of the security guards looked at him in anger, and he said, I hope he wasn't upset with me. So that's the caliber of people we have, in this MK Special Operations Unit and in other MK structures and NC structures. So you're right, Thula. That was the heyday, if you like, of MK for major operations. And I mean, it really did assist to lift people's morale. And we can debate these things about how far such operations assisted the mass struggle and how far they almost de-emphasized it to some extent, because people said, our liberators will come from Lusaka and Angola, and we don't have to do much. And that's discussed in the book. My own view is, for what it's worth, I think it might have demotivated some people, these militarist illusions. I think Slomo refers to that. But for the most part, it really inspired people. It made them feel the ANC is here and, we need to fight. And the evidence is that mass struggles did take an upturn from 1984-85 onwards. How much MK Special Operations Unit or the armed struggle as a whole, with MK as a whole, contributed to that is debatable. But that it didn't de-emphasize the armed struggle, and the mass struggle, seems to me just empirically and on the surface correct. So yes, Thula, you're right. That was the best time, of MK in effectiveness and efficiency and impact.
But it's precisely that, as you said, these things are very difficult to measure or to quantify. And today one can look back and say it was successful in, the wider impact it had, as you just explained, in terms of morale, for example. But at the time, how did the movement assess the success of the operations? And one thinks of Oliver Tambo's speech in 1984 on the 4 pillars of struggle. To what extent it fitted into that?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, Thula's written on MK, he'll have his own views as well. I'm not sure if you've written, Lindie, but it's a matter we must continue to debate. It can never be closed. But the way I see it, and I think this is set out in the book, I don't know exactly how, I've forgotten now. But, I don't think that the armed struggle was as effective as presented in the romanticized pictures of the ANC and MK and the movement as a whole. But it certainly wasn't as ineffective as is made out by scholars and others, excuse me, and the ANC's detractors. It was somewhere in between that glorious armed struggle and it being a ragtag army that got nowhere. I don't believe that we would have got to where we did in 1994 were it not for the armed struggle as part of one of the 4 pillars of struggle. And to see the effectiveness of MK Special Ops or MK as a whole, one has to be clear that these different forms or pillars of struggle are interdependent. But primarily, it's the mass struggle. It's the people of this country, led mostly by the ANC, but not solely by it, who brought the state to its knees to the extent that they did, that made it agree to negotiate after 30 long, unnecessary years of an impasse. I think that you see the armed struggle, you can't reduce the value or the importance of the armed struggle to an arithmetic or mathematical formula. How many soldiers fell, SADF soldiers fell? How many operations took place? How many arrests were made? How many people got away? You can look at those things. But that's like reducing the armed struggle to a mathematical or arithmetical formula. The armed struggle had enormous cultural, psychological, emotional, political, and strategic meaning. You can't separate one of these aspects from the other. They're interrelated. Mostly, at one level, African people were brutally inferiorized. And much of that still exists right in our society. And to be able to see African people taking on a white militarist state, whether you agreed with the ANC, whether you agreed with the armed struggle, whether you're a Christian pacifist, with many such people, the mere fact that Black people, African people in particular, were taking on the state was like a sense of, I think, self-esteem also bestowed on them, a sense of pride. Robert McBride puts it very well. You know, I think those aspects, there was a cultural, political, psychological, emotional, and political meaning that far outweighs the number of operations, the number of people arrested just across the border, bad as it was. They couldn't do a thing before they were put in jail, etc. And I think that what gave the ANC currency over Black consciousness, over the emerging Pan-Africanist Congress, is that it was there. It was trying, it was fighting. Never mind the sad number of people arrested and killed and so on. The fact is, people like Tambo and people like Modise and people like Chris Hani and Slovo were heroes. Solon Mashlangu was a hero, you know, and people looked up to them, eulogized them. There were songs made around them, Mashlangu and others, right? Interestingly, in the UDF structures in which I served in the what is now Msunduzi, Pietermaritzburg, many comrades thought Slovo was an African person. And they really loved him because, you know, they would sing songs with Mandela and Sisulu, and then Slovo's name gets slid in and so on. They were regarded as heroes, you know. Harry Gwala, when he came out of prison, because he was there for 2 spells, MK, he was seen as a hero. That's my experience of the youth of the, excuse me, mid and late 80s. So I don't think there's a question but that it was the mass struggle primarily. And you know, this issue of the relationship between the armed struggle and the mass struggles, there have been persistent questions raised in every national liberation struggle. And in different phases of a struggle, depending on the balance of forces, the context, the international climate, etc., the relationship differs between armed and mass struggles. At times, the armed struggle becomes preeminent, like in the early 60s, because the ANC is decimated inside the country. At other times, after 1976 onwards, the mass struggle is the key factor, really. That's why we talk about armed propaganda supporting that mass struggle and pushing it forward. But it's the mass struggle that's the orbit of the underground, political underground, of the armed struggle and of international struggles against apartheid. That also contributed, but it's the mass struggle really that was key. And I think that it's never an easy question to deal with. You see, the ANC kept saying politics is in command. That's the theory. But in practice, there was a strong militaristic ethos, especially after 1976, where those young people who joined the ANC had no intention of negotiating with that state, that brutal state. They wanted to fight. And all of that was true, but it's the youth and others inside the country. We shouldn't also forget the power of the trade union movement. COSATU then and COSATU now are completely different entities, right? I mean, you think of the mass stayaways over May Day. The state was forced to give May Day as a holiday. I mean, at times, 2.5 million people throughout the country, if I have the figures right. The images were certainly, you see, it doesn't matter whether it's 2 or 2.5 million or 1.5 million. The images, even on our own state-owned TV, in the newspapers that were liberal, yes, but, you know, within a certain conservative mold, I think. Those images, and you yourself being part of a mass stay away, even as a young person, right? And you see all these people, that's power. And the trade union movement played a very, very important role, not recognized sufficiently. And now that I think about it, Thula, hardly mentioned in this book. So here's one thing that's one of many gaps you pick up when you engage with people around this book. And as I say towards the end, this is an initial foray into MK Special Ops, okay? I hope somebody picks up all the material that's going to be soon there by the end of September, the interviews on South African History Online, and also obviously on Nelson Mandela Foundation Archives, and I think Castro Quela, who does a lot, wants it, and other people, whichever university wants it, can take it. Hopefully the students will do masters and honors theses on this, and hopefully put articles and books. There are many, many gaps here, my friends, right? And
Awesome.
I'm no researcher, and I worked intermittently. I do wonder, though, you know, I was talking to somebody last night who had something to say about the book, having read it. I do wonder if I had have concentrated, say, 6 months to write it up, whether it would have taken a different form if I had a researcher. But there are many gaps. And I think, for example, the Koeberg operation, a book can be written on that on its own. You know, David Moise, wonderful, wonderful person. You must read the profile of him. Self-effacing, not politically correct, just the way he is. I asked him. So he was in death row, or SASOL, right? But he came back in country. So I say to him, just you listen to him. I say to him, oh, so now that the ANC has become what it has, and the country has become sadly what it has, would you still have done what you did in the 1980s had you known this will happen? He says, yes. I want to thank the ANC for giving me the opportunity to serve. I said, how now, David? You ended up on death row. You could have died. He said, yeah, it just happened. But hey, you know what? I'm here. Others have died. And he's not being politically correct, David Moise. I wish I could find somebody who would do a profile, a book on him, you know, a biography. He's a remarkable guy. He died recently. So what I want to say to you is, you can't separate, in short, the armed struggle. It's interdependent with the other forms of struggle. And it made a contribution, unrecognized. And in some small way, I hope that this book contributes to an understanding that, hey, many mistakes were made. People are frail. They have their frailties, their difficulties, their bad sides, but they also have their good sides. And Thula's done that wonderful, what I call dictionary of MK events. Wonderful, right? It's like a reference book for many of us. That too is a contribution, as are other books. But I feel that not enough has been said about MK. And I hope that not just on this unit, Special Ops, others will write more on many other units that are unrecognized. There are many other David Moises around that we don't even know.
Let's speak about a couple more in the context of this interview, for sure. In the we've now got to the mid to late 80s, and one of the features of your book is how prominent Durban comes to be around that time. Can you tell us about the spot SOU in that city and region?
Yeah, basically it became known as the bomb city, right? Because of the number of bombs that went out. I think 18 operations within 6 months. It came just after the doctors unit was arrested in December 1985. So it started off, I think, on January 6th, and the last operation was 30th June, led by what I call the Webster McBride unit, Gordon Webster and Robert McBride. So basically, these were two so-called colored comrades who, well, the one, Robert, was living in Witwat, and the other just outside my hometown, and, you know, Pietermaritzburg. And they interestingly met on their first day at Pesce College. They both opted to do teaching. They took to each other immediately. They both liked rugby and boxing. Both came from the rural areas. Both had Irish ancestry, and they just clicked. Very, very different personalities. One a complete extrovert, or an extrovert, and the other a very quiet guy, obviously being McBride and Webster. So Gordon Webster decides he wants to leave the country to get training. He thinks it's a waste of time continuing with the mass struggle. Even the local campus police were so repressive when they went on a demonstration. So he leaves the country, he comes back, and he recruits Robert into special ops. And so they carry out these operations. Perhaps the one that stands out the most for its remarkable nature is Robert's rescue of Gordon Webster from the Eatondale police station outside within my hometown in St. Lucie, right? And something that's never happened before that I know of. I asked people, has it ever happened in MK? And well, nobody can recall, but maybe Thula, you know something, I don't know. But it's remarkable that they go into the police, they go into the hospital. He's been shot very badly, and he's got all these tubes and so on running in. So with the cooperation of a doctor, empathetic doctor within Eatondale Hospital, and one of Robert's brother's, I think, partner, who's a nurse, who manages to get in, though she's not a nurse there, she's a nurse elsewhere, I think, somewhere in Etegwini, Durban, but she gets in there and they connect, and so they go in and they rescue it. I drew a lot on Mokai's book, it's online. The vivid descriptions Robert gives about what happens there. And unfortunately, he went in with his father, Derek, now deceased. They dressed as doctors. And unfortunately, one of the people, was it one? I think, one of the people who was sitting outside the ward where Webster was, got shot because he was sitting next to a policeman, and gunfire broke out, and another got injured, and they extracted Gordon in a remarkable operation, which about 7 of them were involved, all from Wentworth, almost all from Wentworth, and Greta Applegrim is very involved in it as well, Matthew Lecordia, and so on. And they whisked him out of South Africa in a remarkable way. You see, Robert's father, Derek, was a welder and worked on cars and panel beater. And Robert had learned some skills from that. So he asked Greta Applegrim to hire a caravan. And he built what you call a dead letter box under the caravan, a hidden compartment. And as Gordon finally reluctantly agreed to leave, he had to see his partner. And when she came to see him to say goodbye, she couldn't bear to separate from him. And she started tearing, and Robert grudgingly and reluctantly decided to expand that hidden compartment, and he did it. So both of them were in the back of the caravan. What he did was, he had bottles of milk, sterilized milk, to suggest they're going camping. He had beer bottles flung all over, empty beer bottles and crisps and all sorts of things to make it stench and look uncomfortable, so nobody wanted to look into the caravan carefully. So, of course, they were in the back of the caravan, and 5 minutes before the border with Botswana, he stopped the caravan and the car leading the caravan and put both of them into that compartment. And they crossed the border on the South African side, seamlessly, no issue. But when they get to the Botswana side, a very officious immigration officer says, open in the back. And then he opens the caravan, and she looks inside, and she says, but I can't see anything. He says, no, something about the battery not working and the light. And she went in, and she said, it stinks. She couldn't bear it. She sort of said something like, I can't remember. How can you tolerate this? And left in half, which suited them. So, of course, they got him across. He was then taken to, I think, the Soviet Union to recuperate and so on. He and Anne, his partner, married in Lusaka. But then comes McBride's arrest in the middle of 1986, I think just after 30th of June. He's trying to get out of the country also because they're looking for him. So when McBride's arrested, Webster decides, no, he must go back, try to rescue him. At that stage, Hani and I think Modise and I think Rashid told him, no, you can't do that. He's actually inside a police cell, not a hospital. It's not going to be easy. And finally, I think it's Hani that relented and said, okay, go in. So Anne, of course, Gordon's partner, says, no, she wants to play a role as well. If I'm correct, she was pregnant at the time. So she comes in 2 weeks earlier to set up a base. And then a guy, MK named Casanova, is allocated to work with Gordon Webster to look for a way of rescuing Robert. But just as they crossed the border into South Africa, they're arrested. Obviously, there's some leak. So Gordon gets 25 years for coming back into the country to try to rescue his friend Robert. Brian Roston's book on Robert McBride, Till Babylon Falls, The Struggle Continues, the later version, gives you remarkable pictures of the things that Robert had done for Gordon when he was inside the country, wiping his backside, sitting there and looking at him. And one of the brothers says they were like brothers, like blood brothers. They couldn't live without each other. You know, I asked Robert, was there a pact between you? That if one of you got arrested, the other would try to rescue you. He said no to me. But in other interviews, he said yes. And to both Rashid and Greta, according to them, he also said there was a pact. But it's neither here nor there. Whether there was a written pact or not, a verbal pact, it doesn't matter. Robert puts it nicely. He says, look, man, we knew we didn't have to have a pact, that if one of us got arrested, the other would try to rescue us. Now, you know, Robert has become a figure of controversy post-1990. I mean, I think there's aspects to him that are of the sort that is projected in the media. He's a maverick, he's impulsive, he's inconsistent, etc. That side is probably there. I'm not a psychologist. I did 3 interviews with him and read enormously about him. But there's another side to him that is not sufficiently acknowledged. And I hope people listening into this will at some stage after September this year read the 3 interviews that I've put into a single interview now. What comes across in the interview is a very erudite, thoughtful, morally driven person, actually. A very, very sort of insightful about the armed struggle and its meaning. Oh, yes, that ebullient strident side of him is there. But his ideas, his views, his sense of strategy and tactics, I mean, is remarkable. He's obviously thought a lot. He's been studying a lot. And he's not acknowledged for that. And if you look at the TRC records, I must say, he was remarkable in explaining that he regrets the civilian deaths in the Magoo's bar bombing, but he's not going to apologize for his role in the armed struggle. He strikes a very good balance, I think. And the Magoo's bar bombing, I said there are 2 things that started. One, of course, was that spectacular rescue of Gordon Webster from Edendale Hospital. The other, of course, is the controversial one, the Magoo's bar bombing. And it's unfortunate what happened there. And the evidence that was presented at the TRC by him is very debatable and questionable. But overall, if you look at the armed struggle as a whole, there were very few deaths. And certainly compared to what the SADF and the SAA in the neighboring states did and the SADF did in our country, but that's not the only violence. The people that were dispossessed of their land, the number of forced removals. I don't know the figure, you the historians, I think over 2 million people were forcibly removed and so on. The violence that that leads to, right? I'm not justifying what happened in Magoos, but it's understandable what happened. And in the scheme of things overall, it's unfortunate, it's collateral damage, you know? In a civil war, both sides lose civilians, as it were, or civilians on neither side, and they caught up in it. But what more could Robert have done? He reached out to many of the people, those who met him. He apologized to, including, I think, Beki Ngobane, the guy that was constable, the guy that was killed, who was sitting next to the constable at the Edendale Hospital. I think, in a way, both sides, those who suffered injury and death and their families, and Robert McBride and Greta Appelgren and Derek McBride and others suffered, actually. I mean, what did Robert get out of waging the armed struggle? He was in death row, right? And so on both sides, regrettably, there was hardship. Greta still has to deal with it. She's a very religious person. And she says in various publications, not in this book, that she, every now and then, it comes back to her, the gravity of what happened. Of course, she doesn't apologize for playing a role in the armed struggle. She's there in the ANC Veterans League. She's there in the MK Veterans structure. But both sides in that Magoos bombing bore negative consequences. And we've moved on. And I think that it's time that the ANC itself came to terms with the fact that Robert has to be acknowledged and his comrades for their role. While we can have our own views within the ANC and outside it about the Magoos bombing, that was a part of the struggle. And there were definitely security police there. On that, I'm clear. The numbers, I don't know. The TRC itself came to no conclusion. My sense is, from what I've put together, and I could be wrong, there were far fewer policemen there than I think was actually suggested, but far more than is made out in the public domain. According to, well, you should read the chapter. According to what Greta says, what lawyers say, when they looked up the background of many of these people, they were in some or other aspect of the security of the state. But, you know, at the end of the day, we came to negotiate remarkably in 1990. I mean, who foresaw that we'll sit around a conference table? And whatever the young people say about the negotiated transition, the balance of forces then, with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the retreat of social democracies in the West, the consequences of dealing with constant attrition between the state and its opponents, the pressure from Kaunda and other Southern African leaders, the devastation being caused to Mozambique and surrounding neighboring countries, all meant that the ANC was propelled to the negotiation process. And it did what it did. And we can address the weaknesses of that process of negotiations over time. But I think in those circumstances, we were not able to move much further than we did, except we could have done more to ensure economic transformation. But the Magoos bombing is part of our collective history. Wherever we are, whatever side we belong to, or if no side at all, that's part of our collective history.
But as you refer to, the negotiated transition and, enemies who finally came and sat around a table, I would like to know, how did the end come for this unit? Could you tell us about its disbandment?
Yeah, well, partly the MK Special Ops Unit had many similar challenges to MK as a whole. It wasn't able to sufficiently locate its structures inside the country. They were hit and run operations. They came in, carried out an operation, and we were lucky, got out unscathed and left the country. Secondly, the Umkhonto Accord, it had a huge impact because, of course, the main base of MK Special Ops was, the headquarters, if you like, was Maputo. And many of its leaders, not least Slovo and Rashid and others, had to exit, and that undermined them. Thirdly, in Swaziland, which had also signed like a pre-Umkhonto Accord type, pre-Umkhonto Accord, they were being hounded. And Kabuza says that disproportionately it's MK Special Ops people that bore the consequences of the hounding by the Swazi police. Then there were also these issues of resources. They began to decline. Fourthly, also, Slovo had moved from being the commander of Special Ops in 1983 to become chief of staff of MK as a whole. In 87, Rashid gets moved to Ordnance. But most importantly, the mass struggles, there was a huge upsurge. And the role of armed propaganda in a context where the masses are taking to rudimentary forms of armed struggle themselves, using stones and petrol bombs and pistols and so on, it began to recede in importance. And the ANC's strategy after the Kabwe 1985 conference was towards what they call people's war, arming the masses, but in not like an unconditional way, you know, in a selective way, so that, you know, people who got access to arms used it for the purpose for which it was meant to be. But also infiltration, betrayals, the loss of many, Bani Molekwane, Vincent Seketi, Victor Kayana, the very experienced comrades who had been involved in several operations. Many of them were killed. So for all these reasons, by the late 80s, Special Ops begins to peter out. And then came the negotiations.
Thank you very much. Finally, could you just tell us a bit more? We've mentioned it in various parts of the interview, but can you tell us a bit more about the overall project of which this book is a part?
Yeah, well, firstly, it's not just a book. We're going to use aspects of what was drawn for the project, the material. As I said, on the website, there's this podcast and so on. And I'm looking for people to carry on writing up different parts of Special Ops. I must say that the comrades who took part in Special Ops gave their time very freely. And they were very, very enthusiastic about this. In fact, one or two of them said to me, "Why are you coming now after all these years? No one has ever asked us what we did since 1990. Four got very emotional, two actually tearing and saying, "Comrade, you're the first person to come here." I think I'd owe, and the book owes, an enormous debt of gratitude to the only commander that survived, until now, Rashid, Ismail Abu Baker. He gave enormous amounts of his time and patience. He helped me to locate people, but it's, I must stress, not the writings of an embedded writer or activist or journalist or whatever. I have my own political history, nowhere near as significant as those who I write about. And it was an up and down thing. And you see, understandably, Rashid sees things from the point of a commander, understandably. I wasn't part of the armed struggle. I'm not a commander. I'm also a former sociologist and a journalist, a measure of detachment, even from my own activities in the political terrain. So it was quite topsy-turvy at times, very heated debates. But ultimately, this book would not have the value it has were it not for him. And I feel strongly this shouldn't be, as I've said to others, about the writer. The writer just wrote. I didn't make the history. You should consider interviewing Rashid. Let him speak for himself. There are many, many things he said that are not in this book. There are many things he said. There are some things he said to which I didn't agree with. But he holds those views, and he has a right to that view, as I have the right to my views. But what I must say is Ernest Pule was outstanding. Right? T-Man, as he's known mostly, but you can find the other five MK names. Good luck with you, to you. But he's another person. There's Mkuluti, his MK name. It's Makwale Nialunga. I really think you should interview Rashid and those other comrades, because they will give it to you from the horse's mouth, as we say, right? So, you know, I hope that you or other academics or people pursuing this history thing will do that. And I want to say, you know what? As I say in the book, and it's not false modesty, please, this book wrote itself largely. It was so easy to write. In fact, the writing, you people write, right? The writing is the easiest part. The most difficult part was locating people and getting photographs. But the writing came very easy because they're such wonderful interviews. They're full of life. And you know what? I have learned an enormous lot. I had no idea what I was letting myself in when I started this book. And I wrote it intermittently when I had some time, and then I wouldn't work on it for 6 months and so on. But you know, I have learned a lot. And it's fortified my belief that whatever the ANC is today, sadly, we cannot erase parts of its history. And if it could be that, it can still be that in a very new context. For me, I ain't giving up. Never, never. And it's fortified my belief that whatever it is that the ANC is now, through it and civil society, we need to make this democracy work. We owe it to those people and the many, many others who gave their lives. We just cannot let this country, with its immense potential, with its considerable ability to make things work, as unlikely as it seems now, we have to make it work. And I really think that it'd be lovely to have the people who I quote endlessly in this book speak for themselves. They will give you different interpretations to what I said as well. But I take the opportunity of thanking you for your interest, and Thula, particularly you, for your kind words about the book. And yes, I don't have anything more to say unless you have a question.
I just want to say thank you, because again, we have so much history, and I don't think we ever have enough historians for all that needs to be written. And every piece of the puzzle that gets added in this way is incredibly important, also to our collective memory, not just to the body of knowledge. So congratulations and thank you for this work.
Sorry, one last thing I should say. You know the Secret Safari, right? The YouTube. Your listeners might want to look at the Secret Safari because Rodney Wilkinson is regarded as a person who primarily designed the idea that underneath a safari truck, you could put a dead letter box where you can put explosives and arms and so on. And that means you can send large quantities of arms linked to the People's War approach of the ANC. So around 1988, they started this truck. And there's a wonderful YouTube, which you can watch free of charge, called The Secret Safari, about tourists being asked, I think in 2001, British tourists, did you know that when you went to South Africa on safari, you were sitting on a bunker that had all sorts of AK-47s and grenades and limpet mines and all? And if I recall correctly, there's a woman, British woman, that says, really? I don't believe it. But if it's true, it's probably the best thing I've ever done. You mean I tried to help Nelson Mandela get released and apartheid to go? It's a wonderful thing. And the other thing to emphasize is there's a guy, very self-effacing, Iqbal Muhammad Sheikh. He carried out 35 operations. I think one of the few people who survived for so long. From 1982 to 88, he was in special ops. Then when Rashid moved to ordnance, he moved with Rashid. Rashid said, please help because you can bring arms in. And then he took part in taking the arms that were brought in by the safari truck into Johannesburg. Then the drivers, British activists, would take the arms out and put it into cars and so on and leave them in different areas. And Iqbal and a friend of his, Farouk Farista, would go and collect the arms. That's in chapter 26, yes. It's a remarkable story of this guy. He operated together with Muhammad Ismail, who's actually Abu Bakr Ismail's brother, till 1985. And then after 85, he operated on his own. So he carried out 35 operations himself and earlier with Muhammad Ismail. Remarkable guy, self-effacing. You ask him, Don't you want to go into the army or into the municipality or into provincial or national parliament? No. I just did it because it's the right thing to do. I don't want anything in return. So he's also, and his Dolphin unit is also a remarkable case. But there are debates about it, which you can look at in the book. But I'm done, thank you, unless you have anything further to ask.
No, thank you very much for that. And thank you for bringing in the Dolphin unit, which is the most successful in many ways of the SOU's contingents or detachments.
Right,
yes.
yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
No, thank you for your interest.